Hello and welcome to our one-hour forum with Wenatchee Valley law enforcement leaders. I'm Jefferson Robbins with NCW Life. We're here at the local Tel-Event Center at Pybus Public Market. And we're here tonight to talk about new Washington laws that are reforming the way police agencies do business and what local civilians can expect now that they're in force. Some of our questions come from NCW Life viewers like yourself, submitted earlier through our Facebook page. Tonight we're here with Sheriff Briant Burnett, Sheriff of Chelan County, Rick Johnson, Chief of Police for the City of East Wenatchee, Steve Crown, Chief of Police for the City of Wenatchee, and Kevin Morris, Sheriff for Douglas County. Thank you to the four of you for joining us. We'll be asking our four law enforcement leaders for their insights as the landscape of their profession changes, and when we come back in just a moment. Please stay tuned. Enforcement Forum. I'm Jefferson Robbins. 3 different laws that were passed by the state legislature back in May, plus one Supreme Court decision handed down last spring, are expected to have major impact on the tactics police can use and how they might be disciplined when they overstep. Among them, House Bill 1310. This law dictates use of force by a police officer or corrections officer. It says that such force is only permitted to protect against criminal conduct where there is probable cause for an arrest, to effect an arrest or prevent an escape, or to protect against imminent threat of bodily injury to the police officer, to another person, or to the subject being arrested. Chief Rick Johnson had some things to say about House Bill 1310.
Thanks, Jefferson. So our intent tonight is to lay the groundwork for each of these bills, and when we do that, we're going to go over our interpretation of each of the bills, the implementation process that we've gone through so far, and then the anticipated outcome for each of these bills. And we plan to carry that theme with each of us as we go. Between the four of us, I think it's important to note that we have 99 years of law enforcement experience, and we're doing our best to interpret each of these. And again, this is our opinion based on the info that we've gathered from our subject matter experts within our agencies, our local prosecutors, and as well as each other that have all been sounding boards. So we've made a significant effort for the four of us to be consistent on our application of these. So let's talk about 1310. Prior to July 25th, which is when this took effect, the four of us had several meetings and included our elected prosecutors and city prosecutors in those meetings to try and come up with what our interpretation of 1310 is. And you did a good summary of it there. We think it's really 2 or 3 prongs, and the first one being physical force. And prior to July 25th, the threshold, if you will, for the use of physical force for law enforcement was at reasonable suspicion. It could be used during an investigation. And when we talk about physical force, I think it's important to note that it doesn't mean striking or the use of a baton. Those are included in physical force, but it can be much lower levels of physical force. A control hold, a wrist twist, simply an escort, something that causes transient pain is what we have it interpreted the meaning of physical force. I think it's important to note there isn't a widely accepted definition of physical force. That's been left up to your law enforcement leaders right now to come up with what is physical force and what are we going to convey to our people. So along those same lines, like I said, prior to July 25th, it existed that reasonable suspicion was the threshold. And when I say that, I mean, if law enforcement responded to an incident and it appeared that there was crime afoot, a crime was afoot is a term you'll hear, or a phrase you'll hear, they could use physical force to detain those involved. If they did not want to stay, law enforcement asked them to stay, demanded they stay, and then could use physical force if necessary to detain them. That might look like handcuffing someone who didn't want to be handcuffed, placing them in a patrol car while the investigation progressed, and then whether it got to a point where there was probable cause to arrest, that threshold or that determination would be made. After July 25th, the threshold is now probable cause. And I've heard an analogy that I think is easy for a lot of people to understand. Reasonable suspicion on a 100-yard football field is at about 15 yards. A lot of people would say 15 to 20 yards. Probable cause is at the 50-yard line and a little beyond, on the other side of the field 51 out of the 100 yards, it means more likely than not that they have committed this crime. So what does that look like for the law enforcement officer who for the last 20 years, 10 years, 5 years, they're going to change the way they do business, right? There's going to be instances where they would have been under the law able to use physical force to detain someone that they're not there anymore. So I guess that's the first prong. And then the second prong is there's going to be incidents that we have to triage, for lack of a better term, to determine if physical force is likely to be used, and if there's not a crime involved, then it's unlikely that probable cause would be part of that equation. Then that's something that we're going to have to respond to differently than we did in the past, and we can get into that a little more when we talk about what we think the application of this is going to be. But welfare checks, runaway juvenile calls, involuntary commit type calls, those are calls that don't involve a crime per se, and we're going to have to triage those appropriately and decide, is the officer who's receiving the call from Rivercom, are they the right resource to be the primary response on that? And I think it's important to note that historically, law enforcement has been the go-to agency for someone in crisis, someone in distress. A lot of times just something doesn't look right with a person, and we'll receive 911 calls on that, or calls to Rivercom, and law enforcement would get dispatched to go there and triage the call in person, for lack of a better term. Now we need to reevaluate, are we the right agency? Should we be coordinating a response? What resources are available? Those resources become very limited after hours. And quite frankly, I think the four of us, after discussing it at length, we talked about we were the primary agency on, or the catch-all on a lot of these, and that has, under this House bill, that's made that harder to be. And right now, there isn't a replacement agency queued up for a lot of these types of calls.
Well, let me ask this. A lot of the interest in House Bill 1310 has stemmed from questions of civil calls, runaway calls, as you mentioned, and mental health crisis calls. But even before these bills came to the floor, a lot of agencies were sort of retooling in that direction. Diversion teams, for example, are people who go out with police officers and try to de-escalate a mental health crisis when they hear about it. So can any of you care to talk about those programs and those systems that you've already started to put in place for some of your agencies, and will they need retooling in light of House Bill 1310? Does that change the approach you've already tried? Does it change the way you're already trying to change your approach?
I think 1310 actually fits with the approach that was already going on, like you mentioned. For those that aren't familiar with diversion, diversion is a program, for lack of a better term, in our area and across the state that puts those people who are in touch with or in need of mental health resources in touch with people who can facilitate that. And those diversion is partnered with law enforcement a lot of times. Not strictly, but a lot of times is partnered with law enforcement. Several of the agencies have diversion staff members riding along with them, going out and making contact with what I would describe as some of our repeat clients that we deal with due to a lot of times due to behavioral health issues, and trying to divert them away from the emergency room, the regional jail, get them down other paths. And I would say there's agencies in this state, Spokane PD for one, that has a behavioral health unit within their own police department. And that's a direction we're going regionally, already were, like you mentioned, prior to 1310, but it is partnering law enforcement with behavioral health professionals.
And is that approach working for your agencies? Do any of you have an insight into how successful diversion has been, say for Wenatchee Police?
So I would jump on what Chief Johnson was talking about. My perspective goes back 30 years ago, and when I started in law enforcement, you didn't have the type of calls for service that you have in the city and the surrounding area with regards to mental health. Those calls have absolutely quadrupled over my time. It is out of necessity that we started looking from a law enforcement perspective of what other resources are out there. I would say that this is never going to get finished. There is going to be the next iteration of mental health assistance on a yearly basis. I would say that what we're experiencing right now is maybe not the best model that we've seen in the state, and the resources may not be directed in a way that we think would be more successful for people. We simply don't have the resources here locally. Some of these folks are deeply mentally disturbed. There isn't a lot that we can do at a local level, and that requires actually some investment from a state level, if you were to ask me of that. I think there definitely needs to be more invested in that area, because we know it's increasing.
Yeah, and I think I could add to that too, Jefferson, is that, you know, with Chelan County, we were running a BHU deputy, which is behavioral health, and teaming up with our designated crisis responder. And what we're seeing is that if we can take calls away, obviously we want to divert them from criminal activity behavior where we have to actually place them into custody, charge them with a crime, and we're basically going to triage them on scene and try to find resources. Obviously it's a challenge, because as long as someone really doesn't want to have that assistance or help, it's something that you got to continue to go back on and offer and work and try to build a relationship with them where they would trust and do that. And then Chelan County has recently brought on their own, hired, as in the full county, their own behavioral manager and coordinator, with an idea of taking that much bigger, where instead of just going 1 or 2 times a month with a deputy and insisting in that, is something we do more full time, and also seeing that on the jail side of all is just trying to get a bigger response. So I think that's really the focus of the future, and how we can minimize some of the calls and bringing those people into our criminal justice system.
And Sheriff Morris, has diversion been used in your agency as well?
Yeah, we participate with the same programs. I'd like to add that this is a program that started before this new legislation. What we would do is partner with diversion to establish the best course of action for the individual or individuals we were dealing with. Jail is not always the right place for these folks to go. We were able to use physical force to restrain somebody, get them the medical help that they needed prior to this legislation. There is confusion now. It is not a crime to be having a mental break. The legislation further goes to encourage law enforcement, or tells law enforcement, if a crime isn't being, has been, or is about to be committed, you should consider leaving the area. That creates concern in our profession. Should we even go? I can share with our community and you that the 4 of us, we are responding to calls. It's just how long we're going to be there, how we're triaging it, and what the end result looks like may be different in the view of our citizens than they are used to. And it's because we're trying to stay within the confines of these new laws.
And that will change or influence how you support diversion calls. Diversion specialists who are responding to a mental health crisis, will they or won't they have the kind of police support that you feel you should be able to give?
It certainly can, especially we have determined there's a difference between a combative subject and an assaultive subject. A combative subject with our diversion team is not meeting the probable cause threshold of a crime. Therefore, our likelihood of using physical force to restrain them to get them help is pretty much eliminated at this point.
Well, House Bill 1310 is not the only new law dictating how police need to deal with physical situations. When we come back after the short break, we'll talk about one of the other ones. Be right back. Welcome back to the NCW Life Law Enforcement Forum. We're here with Wenatchee Valley's top police officers to talk about how the new laws that have been passed in the state of Washington are affecting the way they do their jobs. House Bill 1054 is another one of those laws. It puts limits on the kind of physical tactics and equipment Washington police agencies can use. Under this law, police may not use chokeholds or neck restraints to control another person. Their agencies may not use or acquire military equipment. And it puts restrictions on how and when police can chase a suspect driver. only in the case of DUI offenses or suspected violent offenses or sex offenses. Some pursuits will also require permission and oversight from a police officer's supervisor. We'll talk to the top supervisor of Wenatchee Police right now, Chief Steve Crown.
Thanks, Jefferson. You're right, House Bill 1054 has a lot of moving pieces to it. I think that one thing that sticks out right off the bat is vehicle pursuits. Right now, all area law enforcement here in the Valley are training on emergency vehicle operation, and so one of those components is clearly dealing with vehicle pursuits. This House Bill 1054 strongly limits the ability to pursue vehicles. Just to cover a few of the points on this one, you have to have probable cause. You heard Chief Johnson talk about the difference between probable cause and reasonable suspicion. So probable cause is a pretty big standard to hit, and you can only engage in a pursuit with violent offenses, sex offenses, or escape. And out of that, reasonable suspicion can be used for DUI offenses, as you mentioned. But there's also the other tangible piece to this, which is dealing with an imminent threat to the public out of the pursuit. So I have used an analogy before on how the probable cause piece of this works. If you had a robbery that takes place in the city of Wenatchee and a police officer is responding to that call for service, they may be 5 blocks away, but over Rivercom radio service, they alert local law enforcement that it's a blue sedan with a driver with a hoodie. Take a look out your window any given time and you'll see a lot of blue sedans with people driving with hoodies on. Officer is responding to that, looks out the window, sees a car that's going a little bit faster than the other cars, and it's reasonable to suggest that that might be the suspect. If the officer pulls around behind the vehicle, turns on their lights, and tries to stop that vehicle and the vehicle takes off, that pursuit has to stop based off the new laws. And so that's a definite change to what we've seen in the past. It's clear that our legislature was concerned about vehicle pursuits, and they limited them drastically. The other piece that I'll mention is on the next slide where we talk about violent offenses. And if you take a look at those, they're mostly Class A felonies. And off to the right of your screen is really the ones that we focused in on, is that misdemeanor assaults, even domestic violence, is not one of those violent offenses. Somebody could come up to you and punch you in the face, jump in a car, drive away, and we're right behind the vehicle. We're not going to be able to stop that vehicle if they engage in evasive maneuvers, and it starts looking like a pursuit. So we'll have to end those. Residential burglary, another one that is near and dear to pretty much everybody. Invading your home is not one of those things that you can pursue a vehicle for. So we're going to see a drastic change in that. The other pieces of this are tactics and equipment. So from a tactics standpoint, I think I've provided a couple of slides that maybe back at the studio they can actually pull up what a vascular neck restraint looks like. It is vastly different than, say, a chokehold. On MMA fighting on any given weekend, you can see a submission hold that it looks very much like a vascular neck restraint. The difference is they usually have a referee standing over the top of the two fighters, and they're making sure that vascular neck restraint is applied properly and nobody gets hurt. So that was a tactic that very clear early on we knew that was going to be taken off the available uses of force. Shooting at moving vehicles is another one. I think everybody in this valley already has that in our policies and had it in our policies well before the bill took effect.
Not to open fire on a moving vehicle.
Not to open fire on a moving vehicle. the other one that's interesting about this bill is tear gas, the deployment of tear gas. And now there's different avenues even defined in that bill that talk about correctional facilities can use tear gas and have a wholly different set of rules for a correctional institute to follow. But here in Wenatchee, we live very close to Gorge Amphitheater. We have been called as this valley to go assist with riots. Tear gas is one of those things that is limited in its use. It requires to get authorization from the highest elected official in the county or city in which you plan on using it within a riot. And then the other two pieces are use of tear gas on a barricaded subject. In those situations, you only need to require the approval from a supervisor.
So if there's a riot in downtown Wenatchee, it's the mayor whose jurisdiction is called upon to authorize the use of tear gas.
That's correct, and I don't know too many mayors that are out there that have actually gone through the Criminal Justice Training Commission and even have a sense of use of force, but I'm sure there's few of them out there.
What does this bill do? What does this new law do to equipment restrictions? There are limitations on the kinds of items you can procure and the kinds you can deploy for law enforcement.
Right, there was a lot of stuff that was listed in there. Most of it was armed vehicle, armed aircraft, armed boats. I've never seen any of those in my 30 years of law enforcement, but they were in the bill. The other thing that was very peculiar for us, and we knew was going to be difficult right off the bat, is they prohibited the use of any firearm over 50 caliber. Well, 50 caliber is smaller, actually, than a 12-gauge shotgun. We use, at the city of Wenatchee, 12-gauge shotguns to propel beanbag rounds that are less lethal options of force. We also have procured over the last 2 years 40 millimeter launchers, which launch a foam-based projectile that is far more user friendly. It is a more useful tool even than the beanbag rounds. But both of those are prohibited by the mere fact that they are defined as firearms. They shoot a projectile using gunpowder with primer and a shell. And so those laws became, or those tools became prohibited when this bill was passed.
Now, are beanbag launchers less than lethal projectile launchers used by all 4 departments? Do they all have them in your arsenals?
They were.
They were, and they are no longer because of this law.
And that's where I think some of the legislators came back and said, well, that wasn't the intent. But the problem is it's confusing language, and so we need clarification, and we need it on the true legal side so we know exactly what we can, because we're going to be talking about some other bills here that puts our officers at risk with personal liability rather than just the agency.
And other kinds of equipment, mobile equipment. We're familiar with going down to Apple Blossom and seeing the SRT vehicles parked there that are used by all departments for special response. Do those vehicles now have to go away?
No, that was actually something in this legislative session that we were able to reach out to some of the legislatures and make sure that those weren't removed. A vehicle that normally costs on a commercial basis $400,000 to $550,000 to procure cost our departments nothing to procure for the military surplus program. So we were lucky in that regards.
Let's talk about pursuit for a moment, because there's a difference, I think, in the public mind between pursuing and following. What restricts a police officer from following a suspect or a subject who they think might be involved with a crime? Anything in the law?
Well, I think that the major factor is the behavior of the pursued driver. And so if they're being evasive, exceeding the speed limit by a substantial amount, that's the biggest difference, is the behavior of the individual that fails to yield once they have lights and sirens going behind them. That's a difference between a stop and a pursuit. And based on these law changes and previous policy that had already been implemented here on a local basis, we had the authority within our first line supervisors, our sergeants and corporals, to terminate a pursuit if it became hazardous to the public, if there was icy conditions, too many vehicles on the road. our supervisors had that ability to terminate those pursuits already.
And it's often been done by all agencies, to my
Yes.
understanding. That
Yes.
Pursuits have often been terminated. But what about the use of pursuit intervention techniques or pit maneuvers that have sometimes been used around our valley to stop fleeing vehicles by pushing them off alignment and sending them into a slow spin? Is this legislation now the end of the pit maneuver as we've seen it?
I don't think so. So the pit maneuver is used to terminate a pursuit intervention technique. All 4 agencies are training regionally on pit. We trained together last year. For the first time we did it, all 4 of us up at the Super Oval. But if the agency that's involved in the pursuit is following the law, meaning it meets the criteria that Chief Crown discussed, then the pit would still be on the table for an option to end that pursuit.
There was a high-profile pursuit back around July 24th when a sheriff's deputy with Chelan County broke off pursuit of a bus that had been stolen from a Leavenworth rafting company. And in his report, the deputy cited the new law as part of the reason for not continuing the chase. Since there had been no violent crime committed, Wenatchee Police and Douglas County Sheriff's deputies were also involved in this pursuit. Again, did not continue pursuit, I think citing the same reasons. But that was 1054, which did not take effect until July 25th, the day after this pursuit took place. So why that level of caution in that particular case? Was the law really at play there, or was it simply a situation where you would have terminated under ordinary circumstances?
Well, not necessarily, but I think when you look at the big picture of when you look at this totality of what the officers individually are taking on, because we're going to talk about decertification, we're going to talk about potential criminal charges, a use of force, where we have a mandate to report now, a lot of different things where the agency might have been able to absorb a lawsuit in some sort. This puts the direct liability on the officer, and so they're going to weigh the risk in the community. And we like to say, what's the governmental interest? Along with our lawful authority, and we were just within hours of that. As much as it pained us to try to do that, would we follow that vehicle in what we call a fail to yield situation? I think we could have done that if certain things weren't met on that. But once especially a school bus, which is a large vehicle, heavy, and could do a lot of damage to vehicles, pedestrians, businesses, and stuff like that, is that what's your recourse? Spike strips with a bus. You obviously can't use the pit maneuver, and so this bus was not over the speed limit, but it did start to fail to stop at the lights along Highway 2 and in through the city of Wenatchee. And I think just using air of caution that they said that they would most likely do that. And I think here's the deal: as much as it pains any local law enforcement leader to have to pull it back and say, man, we're potentially allowing someone to get away to do that and put a risk at someone further down the road in the future, we're not willing to risk our own employees. And I think one of our town hall meetings, one of my employees, subject matter experts, said it very good. We all said at one point in time, we're willing to die for you as a citizen, because we made that choice when we pinned the badge and took the oath. But I'm not willing to give up my freedoms to say I'm willing to go to prison for you. And I think that's something that everybody should think about, and what these laws are, what the potential impact both to public safety but to our employees.
We'll talk more about those potential impacts when we come back to discuss Senate Bill 5051. You're watching NCW Life's Law Enforcement Forum. Be right back. Welcome back to the NCW Life Law Enforcement Forum. We're talking about Senate Bill 5051 now, which creates new oversight for police officers in Washington. This new law allows the Washington State Criminal Justice Training Commission to decertify any police officer if they're convicted of a felony, a domestic violence, or a sexually motivated crime, if they violate use of force standards or fail to report another officer for doing so, or if they lie or commit deception or fraud in the course of their police duties. To discuss this, Sheriff Burnett with Chelan County.
Thank you, Jefferson. And this is something I was involved with through the process. I actually got to go on and testify before the Public Safety Committee and just talk about what some things were important there. Obviously, you just mentioned it. One of the big things is having to report to the Criminal Justice Training Commission within 15 days of certain potential death or serious injury caused by use of force or an officer any time an officer has been charged with a crime. But it goes much deeper than that. And again, we've talked about, I mentioned earlier, but the liability that puts on our officers independently. And this is one of the things that weighs heavy when you get a new recruit that says, boy, the liability and the impact and the risk that I take is much greater sometimes than just me giving my life or being injured, but giving up my freedoms. And we talked about that and being charged with a crime. And it kind of goes in circle with 1310 and 5054. Just by itself, it's not that alone, but it's the big picture of this with the other things. And I think it scares most of the officers, whether they're brand new, just going through the academy, or they're the tenured and they got 20, 25, 30 years and they're getting close to retirement. So we're looking at issues as far as retention and in recruitment and what that's going to look like in the future and making it more challenging, no doubt. But I can guarantee you that each one of us here and the other law enforcement leaders across our state want to be able to have good accountability and to be able to discipline and terminate those employees that we believe are a discredit to the communities that we serve. Binding arbitration obviously is a challenge for that as well. But I think one of the things we need to go back and look at that's important is how we got there in the makeup, because this bill changes the composition of the Criminal Justice Training Commission, and those commissioners are appointed by the governor. I was actually appointed, and one of the two sheriffs appointed by the governor. My term was running from October of 2018. It was supposed to run till, I think, June of 2024, and we had Initiative 940 pass in 2019, and it started with some testimony from our victim advocate groups. And I sat in some of those meetings and listened to a lot of that testimony. And one of the things that they were pushing real hard was that they wanted to have better citizen involvement. And so we went from a 14-member commission panel to a 16, and we thought we did well. It's like, well, let's add a couple citizens at large on that. And then as soon as we passed that at the end of 2019, that passed in 2019, and we worked through the language on that and brought on those two extra commissioners in 2020. As soon as that was done at the end of 2020, we moved into 2021 and the new legislation for this, and they were trying to eliminate a sheriff's position and a chief's position, and that's what I was testifying is please let's not get rid of the subject matter experts. Let's keep them in there. Let's keep the voice of the sheriffs and the chiefs who have spent our careers trying to promote public safety and the quality of life within our communities. So here we go moving forward, and we thought we actually had maybe retained that. We actually lost that. They went from a 16 member commission to a 21, and they added 7, and they made it a total of 7 citizens at large. So this is a big piece of that where we feel like we're losing the subject matter expert piece, and maybe a little bit to being able to govern and police the way we want to in
The
our
law
own
enforcement
backyards.
executives lost some representation on
Absolutely.
the commission, and that commission is the one that will make decisions concerning decertifying.
Correct.
All right. One thing I wanted to clear up, you mentioned that there's a concern about decertification that follows from a charging of a felony, but my understanding of the law is it's a conviction of a felony. Is that right?
Actually, I might need some help on that one.
Charges have to be reported.
Or a dismissal. A department dismissal for these same kind of issues can also lead to decertification under the law, if I understand correctly.
I think the charges of a crime have to be immediately reported. The Criminal Justice Training Commission has the option at that point to suspend that officer's police powers. Then they can wait until the full adjudication of that case before going to the next stage of revocation.
I think one of the main points we need to talk about when we're talking about the decertification of 5051 is originally it would be the agency had done the investigation, had sustained findings, and they would take that and go to the Criminal Justice Training Commission and provide it for a review for decertification or a request. What we see now is that it can come from an independent complaint, it could come through the Criminal Justice Training Commission. They could do their own investigation, but because of collective bargaining agreements and binding arbitration, the agency may have gone through their own investigation, and if the findings are grieved and challenged, they'll go through their step 2 grievance with the sheriff or the chief, on to the step 2 with the next, which would be the mayor or commissioners, and then potentially binding arbitration, and they could potentially uphold that employee would not be disciplined to the point of termination. So now you have a decommissioning, maybe on the decertification side of it, but yet you have an employee that still has to be employed. So what do you do with that employee? So there's some confliction there, potential, and I'm sure we're going to see some cases like that in the near future.
Is it possible the grievance and arbitration process would change to reflect what the new law is on the ground, or is that much more difficult to alter?
Well, that would have to take a change by the legislators. Every agency in the state of Washington has a collective bargaining agreement that is negotiated between the employees and the appointing authority. So those are mandatory, subject to bargaining. And the only thing that really trumps that is state law. And I'm not sure if that's something that is in the works. But that would be the only avenue that I could see.
5051, I'm sorry, please continue.
Well, I'd just like to come back to the concern in decertification and suspension. Prior to this law, CJTC could decertify you. Generally, it was when the agency requested that decertification for certain reasons. This new law has mandatory decertification list and discretionary. CJTC is that discretionary entity right now. Two of the mandatory decertifications are failure to intervene. We're still working to get clarity on what actually is an intervention. What we mean by that is one officer may go back up another officer and they help them with something, or give them another suggestion. Let's sit this individual up versus having them lay down. We all either have or are getting body cameras. Is that an intervention? I can tell you, in our profession, we don't see officers and deputies, after just doing their job, report that to a supervisor. It is a requirement in the law. If CJTC determines that they failed to do that, and it was determined it was intervention, a deputy or officer may lose their certification, their livelihood. There's so much unclarity on this. Nobody's fighting or would fight dishonesty and all of those other egregious wrongdoings by law enforcement professionals that they probably shouldn't be in this profession. It's that clarity of how minor a mistake, a human mistake, which is who we hire, how minor of a mistake is going to cost them their career.
Let me ask this about arbitration and contracts. Will your departments have to renegotiate the existing contracts with 5051 in mind, or do you have a grace period to wait until the next contract term comes up?
So one of the pieces in the bill requires an agency to keep all personnel records on an individual employee through their entire career, plus 10 years. Our collective bargaining agreement has, it just has language that is consistent with the Secretary of State's retention schedule. And so that would be one issue that may have to be renegotiated in regards to this. But I would say, just as Sheriff Morris said, there's going to be a lot of case law that comes out of this as cases work through the system. I can't imagine that you're not going to see some changes with regards to collective bargaining agreement, arbitration, and some of these other outcomes as it relates to a violation of a suspendable or decertification crime or event, and working through the whole system, as Sheriff Burnett said, that now you have a finding from the agency, you have a arbitrator that may or may not adjust that finding, and then you have the Criminal Justice Training Commission that still has final say over everything. So I think there's several moving pieces that we don't know.
Well, have any of your agencies lost personnel? Has anyone resigned saying, this is the reason I'm quitting? I don't have certainty in my job anymore. Have you lost any people that way?
I have. 2 weeks ago, I had one of my officers come into my office, and there were some other factors, but right forefront was, hey, I didn't know that I was coming to a state like this, and these reform measures are so hard on an individual that is in law enforcement, and the outcomes, outcome-based decision-making on not necessarily the police officer's tactic, was it right, was it proper, but the outcome is really what's going to end up having the biggest impact on the individual. Yeah, so I've got one that is going to resign and possibly get out of law enforcement. I would say that I'm not alone. I would say that there's other law enforcement agencies across the state that are experiencing the same thing. And the sad thing about it is, it's the youngest. It is the most, the officers that so well represent your community that you would hate to see that person go away from law enforcement, because it is scary. The one thing that law enforcement cannot control through any form of training is the human element. You don't know what the other person in the car, the other person in the house, the other person that is suffering mental health crisis, you don't know what that mental health issue is going to create in a scenario that goes out of control. And that's what I mean by outcome-based, is we get the call, we get the 911 call, and we are supposed to be going to these situations, and that uncertainty of when you get there, am I going to make a mistake because of this rapidly evolving, tense situation? Is that going to be the end of my career, or am I possibly going to go to prison?
Sheriff Morris.
Yeah, to answer your question, I have, in my office, have not had anybody leave yet. But what I do personally know, some young individuals who took the public safety test to getting law enforcement in Washington State have changed their mind. They are not doing that anymore. There has been a lot of talk of earlier retirements in our valley and leaving the state, doing law enforcement in another state. We are unique, Washington State, with some of these laws. Out of the 50 states, we stand alone on some of these new laws. So I do believe we're subject to see some of our professionals that we'd love to see go to another state to do what they desire to do.
Yeah, that's what we're seeing here is, I call it expedited retirements. Maybe they had a plan of doing a couple more years, and they're like, okay, risk analysis, is this worth this to grab a couple more percentage points in my annual retirement pay? And they're saying maybe it's just time for me to call it good and get out while I'm safe. And the other part of that is they're talking about people that are maybe in the earlier mid part of their career, and they're looking at maybe a state that better fits them to continue into their career in policing, and do they be looking to lateral away?
At East Wenatchee, Chief?
At East Wenatchee, we've seen both. We've seen, as the sheriff said, expedited retirements. Several guys that have retired in the last 12 months that just said, you know what, I think it's a good time for me to go. All these changes and recognizing the playing field is changing. And then the second piece we've seen, and I think all the agencies have seen it, is we've seen an influx in lateral officers from the west side of the state that have said, I want to come work in a different political climate, still in state obviously, but saying we want to work in a region that we feel law enforcement supported. And I think I can speak for all four of us that we've all seen that over the last 36 months.
When we come back, we'll be talking more about the State versus Blake decision, which deals with the decriminalization of small amounts of drugs. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the NCW Life Law Enforcement Forum. Our final topic for the evening, State versus Blake. This is the Supreme Court decision from the Washington Supreme Court back in February that struck down Washington's felony law on simple possession of a controlled substance. After that decision, the state legislature filled the gap with Senate Bill 5476, making drug possession a misdemeanor that is punishable not by jail, but by diversion into treatment programs. To talk about that, Sheriff Kevin Morris.
Thank you, Jefferson. Yeah, we call it the Blake decision, but it is Senate Bill 5476 as a response to the Washington State Supreme Court's ruling on the Blake case, which essentially made the law that was on the books at the time unenforceable. When they addressed that, adding knowing, a simple word, a culpability of knowingly, they also added some changes to possession. The most noted change is it changed it from a felony, which is the highest level of crime, to possess an illegal narcotic, to a misdemeanor, which is 2 steps down. More importantly, even though possessing an illegal drug is a crime, the enforcement side of that requires us as law enforcement professionals to give a referral to any individual we find committing said crime, possessing heroin, methamphetamine, fentanyl, a referral. Now, the legislation did not provide clarity on what does that referral look like, what needs to be in it. We work together with, again, ourselves and our prosecutors and legal advisors, and we developed a referral. Our deputies and officers now, if they come across somebody possessing an illegal narcotic, they will hand them a referral, and that individual will then go on their way. We cannot arrest them. We cannot seize their person. We can take that product from them because it is an illegal product. However, the challenge for us is this. It's not an arrestable offense, so we can't use force to obtain it. It's going to be a voluntary collection of the illegal drug until the 3rd offense. After 2 referrals, and we record that in a police record, we then can charge them with the misdemeanor offense. This is very challenging because for us to determine the 3rd offense, it has to be in a law enforcement record. The state is not providing any record for us to go to. If someone had 13 referrals from King County, moved to Chelan or Douglas County, and our officers or deputies make contact, it is the first time they are getting a referral. I like to give a scenario that will probably shock most people. If I make a traffic stop right now, the way the law is written, and in the back of that car are 2 passengers, both of them 20-year-old adult males. On the passenger side in the back, that individual has a beer between their legs. The person behind the driver has a syringe with heroin in it in their arm. Under today's law, the individual with the beer in their lap is subject to be arrested and booked into jail for minor possession and consumption of alcohol, which is a gross misdemeanor. The individual, if it's the very first offense, 2nd offense that we have on record, will be given a referral and sent on their way. We have talked amongst one another. We have tried to determine what major impacts are we going to see from the Blake decision, and we're going to see more paraphernalia in the streets. We may see people from another state where it still is illegal and there is incarceration at risk moving to our state because of the likelihood of not being arrested or held criminally liable for using drugs. There's a likelihood we're concerned about of increased drug usage in our community. And again, we are navigating through these legislative laws, trying to maintain the best public safety that we can. Chief Johnson talked about the 99 years of experience the 4 of us have collectively. We're asking the men and women with 1 to 3 years to deal with this and navigate through this at 2 o'clock in the morning in a very unsafe, unsecure environment.
Is there also uncertainty about where the courts then take this once you've given these referrals? Because you're dealing with misdemeanor courts, do we feel like district courts are going to be able to absorb that?
So the referral is to a treatment center. The legislation further goes, we can't forward this to the prosecutor. It is a referral documented by us. It doesn't go to the prosecutor for review. It's not going to be used for future charges. But let's say we come across an individual who we are now on the 3rd offense. The legislation still encourages the prosecutor to defer these cases. It is going to be very difficult to get possession charges in Washington State the way it's written right now. It is important, however, for us to make sure it's clear. Possession to deliver or trafficking or manufacturing illegal drugs is still a crime. It's still a felony. So it didn't change those laws. It is the possession which we at street level deal with an awful lot.
And it sounds like from what you're describing, the referrals don't stick in the same way a criminal record or even a misdemeanor record does. My record, if I'm pulled over, won't show that I've recently gotten a referral in a different county. Is that correct?
With the 4 agencies here, we developed a process to document that through our dispatch center, our Rivercom. That way we can see that information.
So you've developed a response to this change in the law already. So that's hopeful.
Locally.
Yeah.
Locally is the key on that one. If you have somebody from King County that comes over here, the odds of you having that record readily available in the time that you have to legally detain somebody for possession, that's just not going to happen. What this law has essentially done is hamstringed a lot of law enforcement's main thrust. You cannot talk about drug possession and not talk about theft, property crimes, assaults, and every other crime that comes along with it. Now we have to send them with a piece of paper instead of getting any court involved. At least when you had a court where an individual showed up, went through arraignment, and all the court processes, a judge could order treatment. Handing them the piece of paper that has an address and a phone number of a facility in our valley that deals with drug and alcohol addiction is not helpful, because there is zero obligation of that individual to go get that treatment, and it doesn't count towards anything.
And much like these other laws we're talking about, it sort of takes much of the responsibility from law enforcement and puts it towards social services. It makes it a social service question or quandary after that point.
And I think that's one of the big challenges is we're talking about dangerous drugs. We're not talking about medical marijuana here for, an ache in a pain or some medical issue that you're dealing with. We're talking about stuff that will actually end people's lives or send them on spiraling down to a lifelong addiction. And so when we look down the road, 5-10 years down the road under these current laws, what is that going to do? Increase mental health, issues, homelessness and different things like that. So for us, it's like, what do we do to increase our quality of life and try to keep our kids safe from these dangerous drugs? And I think coupled with the fact that our southern border states have seen an 800% increase in fentanyl seizures in the last year from April 2020 to April 2021, with fentanyl being 50 times more potent and dangerous than heroin alone, I think we're looking at a recipe for disaster.
Even with this new set of laws on the books, and even with the State versus Blake decision, nothing rules out interdiction, if I understand it correctly. The Columbia River Drug Task Force does a pretty healthy business in finding people who are transporting, selling large quantities of illicit drugs. So from what I understand, that aspect of policing is not affected by these changes. Is that correct?
Yeah, trafficking, delivery, sales, purchase, no. It doesn't affect that activity, but some of the lower level possession cases end up leading to a chain of additional investigations And that's definitely going to affect law enforcement as well.
The second piece on that, I think it's important to note the Columbia River Drug Task Force, a large portion of the piece of work they do is through the criminal informants, through people. A lot of those people are working off possession charges. They're having to retool and rethink the way they do things in order to get to the dealers. So it is changing business for them and slowing down the pace of what they're doing just from a lack of informants. So we're all having to retool and rethink.
When we come back, we'll have final statements from each of our 4 sheriffs and police chiefs about the changes to Washington law. I'm Jefferson Robbins. You're watching NCW Live. We'll be right back. Welcome back to NCW Live. We've got some final statements from each of our 4 panelists tonight. Speaking first, Wenatchee Police Chief Steve Crown.
We know we've thrown a lot at you, and quite frankly, we've been living this for the last year. The one thing that I would like to leave people with is that, yeah, these are difficult times in law enforcement, but I can tell you without a doubt, it is more important than ever to hire the very best law enforcement officers we can. You need quality deputies and officers out there working. The one thing I would say is that now is more important for getting people into these uniforms and getting them out on the street. I would say that without a doubt, you have some of the best deputies and officers in the state right here in the Valley. And regardless of these laws, we will be coming when you make the phone call to Rivercom.
Thank you, Chief. Speaking next, East Wenatchee Police Chief Rick Johnson.
I want to echo a couple things Chief Crown said. Absolutely, we have some of the best law enforcement professionals in this state at all 4 agencies. Our message to the community and to those individuals is the playing field is changing, but you have some great professionals. They are retooling, recalibrating, rethinking the way we do things. There is other ways to catch criminals that don't involve pursuits. You have some creative individuals working for you and on this stage, and be assured that this is a great community and will continue to be in spite of changes and some of the reforms we're working through.
Thank you, Chief. Speaking next, Douglas County Sheriff Kevin Morris.
I'd like to take this moment to thank our community. We are very blessed, all 4 of us, to have a strong, supportive community, and that is what is making our job much easier. I also want to thank my other leaders in working with one another as well as we have, and we commit to you. We're not going to throw our proverbial sucker into the dirt. We're going to continue to provide the best public safety that we can as we navigate through these new laws.
Thank you very much, Sheriff. Finally tonight, Sheriff Brian Burnett of Chelan County.
I echo what Sheriff Morris just said about the support that we have here in North Central Washington. This is your neighborhood. This is your community. This is your backyard. Thank you for taking the time to be informed. It is time to reach out to your legislators as we look to the authors of these bills to say we need some clarification language. We need to make some adjustments so it doesn't negatively impact our quality of life, your quality of life in the near future. And a couple of things that would impact that, it was just the fact that until we get clarifying languages, a lot of these officers, they're scared, they're worried, they don't know what the future holds. And so it weakens proactivity, which means they're not going out and solving potentially as many crimes, even though, like Chief Johnson said, we're still going to adapt, we're going to do everything we can. And the other big piece to this is the loss of local control. And if you step back and take a 30,000-foot view, you'll notice what we've noticed, and it's a big onslaught and attack from the state towards that, and we want to be able to maintain and govern and police the way that we believe we need to here in North Central Washington.
I want to thank all the sheriffs and police chiefs who were involved in tonight's forum. We want to thank Local Tel Event Center here at Pybus Public Market for lending us the room. We want to thank you, especially the viewers, for tuning in tonight, watching online, offering your questions for this gathering. Thank you all. Take care. Good night.